Hey y'all, Grandma Rose here. It seems like recently, the past few videos that I've done, I mean not all of them, but a few of the recent videos that I've done after thinking about them for a very long time and not knowing whether or not I was actually going to do a video or not. But finally, one last piece of information came in and I had to say something. Well, the same thing has happened today. Now, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while and just had to say something. Now, let me tell you a little bit. Now, one of the reasons why I have a YouTube channel is because I want to teach people the things that I've learned. It's not that I'm particularly smart or anything. I mean, but I'm old enough to have had experiences that many of you who are a lot younger than me haven't had yet. It's kind of like your mom telling you, your dad telling you, you better not do that because this is going to happen. And so you do it anyway, and that happens, and you learn from your own experience. Well, those of us who are older, would love to be able for you to bypass that step and just pay attention to what we've learned to begin with. Well, that's probably not going to happen. But I want to explain to you what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Well, first of all, is I have a degree in biology. I went on and I specialized in botany. Well, so that makes me, I have a graduate degree in botany, and that makes me a scientist. Now, I'm not the kind of scientist who went out in the field and I did ethnobotany and learned from the tribes living in the jungles of someplace, Papua New Guinea or the Amazon or whatever. I'm not that kind of botanist. I don't go out and identify plants except for wanting to because I just enjoy doing that. That's more of a hobby to me. But the kind of botany that I specialized in was a lab course. I worked in the laboratory. I was more of a chemist than I was a biologist. Well, that's not to say that. I was more of a biochemist or as much of a biochemist as I was a biologist, because what I specialized in was cell biology. So, cell biologist, biochemist, and then eventually, not while I was in school, even though I studied it and I learned about it, I didn't actually practice being a molecular biologist until, say, 10 years or so into working. And then my job called for me to do that, and I've had several jobs after that required that. So I can add molecular biologist to the list of things that I've been. Now, that doesn't make me particularly brilliant or particularly smart. I'm not a genius. I was just a science nerd. Yeah, that's all there is, and I got educated in that field. That doesn't make me any smarter than you who are watching this. You're probably smarter than me in a lot of areas. Well, I'm not going to say smarter. Let's say more educated, more experienced in areas that I have no experience in. Definitely not a business person. I'm terrible. I'm not a business person. There's other things that I'm not. But I can learn from you. And I have learned from you. Just like you learned from me. Did you see the title of this video? What about corn oil and beet sugar? Do they contain GMOs? Well, I can tell you right now that they don't. And you're probably not going to pay any attention to me because you've heard everybody tell you that they do. However, how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you have had a chemistry class at some time during your life? Okay. How many of you have studied organic chemistry? Did any of you have to take a course in organic chemistry? If you majored in any kind of biological science, no matter whether it was field or lab or whatever, if you were in pre-med or any of the medical sciences, you had to take organic chemistry. Now that eliminates a lot of you. Any of you who majored in something other than that would not have had to take organic chemistry. Okay? What about biochemistry? I think we're whittling down the numbers of people here. If you were a pre-med major, if you were going into more of a chemistry field or into a medical kind of field or into the kind of biology that I did, more than likely you took biochemistry. So if you've taken biochemistry, you know what I'm going to talk about. However, I know that people are clicking off, they're going off someplace. Now, I'm going to make a point on this, and I want you to understand it. I'm going to try to explain to you why I do not believe that corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, or beet sugar contains GMOs. And I'm going to get to that, and by the time I finish this, if you stay with me, it won't be very long. I'm not going to make this a really long video. But if you stay with me, you'll understand why I think that. So please stay and watch what I have to say. Listen to what I have to say. Ever since I've been on YouTube, ever since I've been watching YouTube, I've watched cooking videos. All kinds of cooking videos. And I've heard people say that they don't use corn oil because corn oil contains GMOs. And I've heard the same thing. I've heard people say they don't use beet sugar. They only use cane sugar because beet sugar contains GMOs. Well, today I watched a video, somebody was making dinner rolls. So the dinner rolls contain oil, and they also contain sugar. That's what makes them a little bit sweet. And this person mentioned both of those in the same video. That was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, and I was prompted to go ahead and make this video that I've put off doing. I hope you'll learn something from it. Okay, let me tell you. We're talking about organic chemistry and biochemistry here. Now, organic molecules contain carbon. So, molecules that are made not just from carbon. Now, organic chemistry includes petrochemicals, fossil fuels, because the fossil fuels are from decayed plant matter, and decayed plant matter contains carbon. So the motor oil you put in your car and the gasoline you put in your car contains carbon. It's a petrochemical. It's from fossilized fuel. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to put motor oil or gasoline on my garden. And I'm not going to eat it or drink it. It'd be poisonous. I'm not going to do that. So even if you've never taken chemistry, you've all seen what's called the periodic table of elements. That's this rectangular table that's got parts sticking up and parts sticking down that have squares and letters and numbers on it that tell you the molecular weight of different elements. Well, what that is, the numbers on those atoms tell you how many electrons spin around the nucleus on those atoms. If you look at the table, the one on the far upper left is hydrogen. Hydrogen is number 1 on the periodic table. It only has 1 electron. Now, if you go over some more to the 6th element, that's carbon. Carbon has 6 electrons. Now, I'm going to get to this in a second and understand what I'm talking about. Well, the way the electrons are arranged around the nucleus, I mean, think about the rings around Saturn. So the way the electrons are in rings around the nucleus will make what is a stable element or an unstable element. And if an element is unstable, then it's going to bond. It's like a magnet. It has the capability of bonding to other elements. Hydrogen is an unstable element, and it will make 1 bond. It will attach 1 time to one other element. Oxygen will bind 2 times. So you could have 2 hydrogen atoms attached to an oxygen. So you can have what's called a double bond. Now, if you look at a diagram of a molecule, if you take methane, which is carbon and 4 hydrogens, and you replace, well, you don't even have to replace the hydrogen, but if you stick an oxygen in between the carbon and the hydrogen, that makes methanol. The OH attached to the end of it turns the gas into an alcohol. It turns it in from a gas to a liquid. And don't ask me why that happens, but it does. And I'm sure chemists who are a chemist would be able to answer that question, but I don't know the answer to that one. But I do know that having 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens and an oxygen is methanol. So that could be written as CH3OH or CH4O. Either way, it's the same molecule. An organic molecule is going to have a C. It's going to have a carbon, because that's the basis for all organic molecules. It has to have a carbon. Now, carbon has 6 electrons, but it's unstable, and it will bind to 4 different elements. So it will make 4 different bonds. Well, oxygen can give you 2. You can bond twice with oxygen. So there would be an oxygen sticking off to the side, because at that point, oxygen couldn't bind with anything else. It already has 2 bonds, and it can only do that. It can only have 2 bonds. So if you have a double bond to an oxygen, then that would make 3 hydrogens that could bond to that molecule. Okay. Or you could have in that the carbon in the middle, 1 carbon, and it could have 4 different hydrogens. Well, if there's a carbon molecule with 4 different hydrogens around it, that's methane. Cow farts. Methane gas is the simplest molecule, the simplest carbon molecule that there is. It's carbon attached to 4 different hydrogens, 4 different bonds. Now, so that's the most simple. Like I said, the most basic carbon-containing molecule is methane. Well, if you put 2 carbons right next to each other, where they bonded to each other, and then put hydrogens all around them, all around the 2 carbons. So there's a carbon here and a carbon there, and hydrogens all around the outside. That's ethane. Now if you do it again and add a 3rd carbon, 3 carbons, you've got 1, 2, 3, and put hydrogens all the way around them, that's called propane. What the most basic carbon molecule is methane. Now this is not an organic molecule, but the most basic molecule containing oxygen, like I said, oxygen can bind 2 times. So the most basic oxygen would have 1 hydrogen, so oxygen in the middle, a hydrogen here, and a hydrogen there. It's an O and 2 H's. Or you could reposition that into H2O. So water is the most basic oxygen-containing compound. That's pretty interesting, huh? Oh, maybe not. So what is biochemistry? That's organic chemistry, things that have carbon in them. So what is biochemistry? How is that different from organic chemistry? Well, biochemistry is the study of compounds that are made within living beings. It can be plants, it can be animals, it can be bugs, it can be worms. I mean, it can be anything as long as it's a living organism. What goes on inside that living organism is called biochemistry or biological chemistry. So let's talk about this. So what do biochemists study? Biochemists study what is going on in living organisms. Nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids are the 4 different kinds of organic molecules. Now, that's what a biochemist studies. And he'll take an organic molecule and he'll learn more about it than you ever want to know. And biochemistry was a very difficult class to me. And there it was, I ended up majoring in it practically. I ended up using it just about every day of my life after I went into graduate school. And that's kind of nuts, isn't it? So that's what biochemistry is. It studies molecules that are made by living organisms. Now let's talk about the first one, nucleic acids. That's RNA and DNA. That's what our genes are. Our genes are DNA. What elements make up nucleic acids? Now this is important now. I want you to get this, because I'm going to be talking about that later on. Well, if you picture the DNA molecule, and you can think of it like a ladder, with the sides of the ladder, up and down, are called the backbone. Also think about railroad tracks, pretty much the same thing. So you've got a ladder that has rungs across, up and down, and that's what the structure of DNA is. The sides of it, the backbone is made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. That's what's in the backbone. Now, the rungs in between it, or if you're thinking about railroad tracks, the railroad ties are made up, I'm doing two here. Come in on the sides, and they, let me see, like that. Come in on the sides, they join in the middle. So think about the rung of the ladder being glued together in the middle. And these are the bases. Now the bases also have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but they include nitrogen. They don't contain phosphorus, they have nitrogen in them. They're called nitrogenous bases. So, in DNA, you're going to have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and nitrogen. That's what's in DNA. All of those elements, every single one of them, is in DNA. Now, look at the proteins. The different bases along that make up the rungs in the DNA, a group of 3 of them code for an amino acid. Now, amino acids. What are amino acids? There's 20 of them. Some I've read 22, but most people say 20 amino acids. And those are the building blocks of a protein. So as the DNA molecule is processed, the group of 3 of the bases together will be read, and it'll code for an amino acid. And so as the gene is being read, this amino acid will be added to that amino acid, to be added another amino acid, another amino acid. It's going to make a chain of amino acids. Okay. All amino acids contain these structures. Okay. Well, all amino acids contain nitrogen. That's what makes them amine, nitrogen. So all amino acids have a central carbon atom. They contain what's called carboxylic acid. That's a COOH group. COOH on the end of it is a carboxylic acid. They contain an amine group. That's where they get the name amino acid, amine. That's NH2. And they contain at least 1 hydrogen atom. They all have at least that. Now, they can also have, and they will have, but all of them have that. Every single amino acid has that. And what makes them different is what's called a variable group. It'll be an R. They just have an R standing for a variable group. So it can be a variation on the theme, and the theme is carbon, COOH, NH2, and H. Okay? So that's what a protein is. So we'll think about what are all these things. Carbon, that's C. COOH is C, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And another hydrogen. NH2 has 2 more hydrogens and a nitrogen. Again, amino acids have nitrogen. Proteins always have nitrogen. Every protein in the world has nitrogen. That's important. So remember, DNA has, they all have the same thing. They all have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Everything has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But the DNA has phosphorus and nitrogen. Proteins don't have phosphorus, but they do have nitrogen. That's kind of the way I used to memorize things. When I was taking tests, I would remember, okay, they all have this, and how are the other things different? So what are carbohydrates? So we've talked about 2 of the different 4 organic molecules. So what's a carbohydrate? I'll give you a definition of a carbohydrate. They're important macromolecules. In other words, they're great big molecules that contain hydrogen, oxygen, and what else? Carbon. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's the only thing that's in a carbohydrate. Nothing else. The way they're put together, the structures of them and the way the carbons, hydrogen, and oxygens are joined make up the difference in all of the different carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates are the most abundant organic molecule in all living things. Of all of the molecules and everything that's living, carbohydrates are the most abundant. Now, the most abundant carbohydrate in the world, the most abundant macromolecule in the world, is cellulose, because there's so many plants, and the cell wall in plants is made up of cellulose, and cellulose is a carbohydrate. So, I learned that when I was in graduate school. The lab that I was in studied cellulose. Now, every carbohydrate, and I'm saying this, every single carbohydrate, I said that 3 times now, originates as products of carbon and water through photosynthesis. So plants make carbohydrates. Animals don't make carbohydrates. Animals have to consume carbohydrates. They're essential to our being, they're essential to our life, but we don't make them ourselves, we have to eat them. We have to consume them. Now sugars are carbohydrates. Sugars only contain Sugars only contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And again, it's the way the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are arranged that makes up the different sugars. A sugar is a form of carbohydrate. So let's talk about the 4th organic molecule. These are all macromolecules. So the 4th macromolecule important to life are lipids. These are fats and oils. And again, lipids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nothing else. Again, it's the way the lipids are organized, the way the composition, how the different atoms in that molecule are organized, make them a lipid. Well, a lipid usually starts off with glycerol. Remember, we talked about methane, ethane, and propane. So that becomes methanol, ethanol, and propanol. Propanol has an OH at the end of it. Well, if you put an OH on the other end of it, then that becomes glycerol. That's glycerin. Glycerol is glycerin. And that's the basis for most lipids. Now, steroids are also the basis for some lipids too. Glycerol has 3 carbons. Now you can add to the carbons. So take off the hydrogen that's attached down on the bottom of it and replace that with a fatty acid. You've heard about fatty acids. So attach a fatty acid to each one of those carbons, and that becomes a triglyceride. Now, these are things that we've all heard of. And again, fatty acids only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Boring, boring, boring. Okay, so what's the point of all this? Why have I gone into all this? When I'm talking about sugar and corn oil and canola oil and soybean oil containing GMOs. Okay, so the video that I watched today, like I said, was making dinner rolls. They had used cane sugar instead of using just regular granulated sugar, which stands a really good chance of coming from sugar beets, because the sugar from sugar beets contains GMOs. At the same time, they said they used sunflower oil instead of corn oil. They had corn oil in a bottle, like Wesson corn oil, but instead of using that, they used sunflower oil because corn oil contains GMOs. Why am I telling you this? I hope you've learned from this. Okay, a GMO starts off as a gene that's being inserted into DNA. So this gene is going to include what? This gene is going to include, remember what the components are of DNA. What are the atoms that make up DNA, the DNA molecule? Well, everything contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Right. What makes DNA different? DNA contains phosphorus and nitrogen. Does either sugar or oil contain phosphorus or oxygen? Does any kind of sugar contain phosphorus or nitrogen? What is a sugar? A sugar is a carbohydrate. And the only thing that's in sugar is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Sugar does not have the components of DNA in it. What about oil? Oil from any organism. It can be saturated oil, it can be unsaturated oil. It can be partially dehydrogenated, it can be completely dehydrogenated, or it can not be dehydrogenated at all. But it contains what? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It does not contain nitrogen. It does not contain phosphorus. It does not contain DNA. It does not contain protein. Neither of these contain DNA or protein. So, think about essential oils. What's in an essential oil? What's in an essential oil? It's oil, right? And it'll contain a fragrance, which is one of the reasons why corn oil tastes different from soybean oil, which tastes different from sunflower oil, which tastes different from olive oil. All of these oils, because they come from different organisms, have a different taste to them. So, when oil is processed from a plant, DNA and protein, or nucleic acids and protein, are waste products. They're not in the final product. They're not included in the oil. Oil is oil is oil, and if it's a pure oil, it's not going to have DNA, it's not going to have protein, and therefore it cannot contain GMO. And the same thing goes for sugar. Now, have you watched Danny King process his sugar cane? Got a cane mill. And in the cane mill, he puts the sugar cane through the mill, and it squeezes out the juice, and then he cooks down the juice to make cane syrup. Well, the same thing happens with the sugar beets. The sugar beets are pressed to get a syrup, or to get a juice, and then the juice is cooked down to make a syrup. And then that syrup is crystallized. And when the syrup is crystallized, now Danny doesn't go that far. Danny stops. I'm talking about Deep South Homestead, Danny King from Deep South Homestead. So Danny stops at the syrup. But if you continue the processing of that and let it crystallize, it's going to be pure sugar. It's going to be pure sucrose. And the DNA and the RNA are waste products. They're not in the sucrose. They're not in that crystallized sugar. So sugar of any kind cannot contain DNA, RNA, protein. It cannot contain nucleic acids or proteins, and therefore it cannot contain GMO. So when you see sugar on sale in the supermarket, and you can get it for $1 a bag or $1.50 a bag, buy the stuff. Don't waste your money on buying cane sugar. It tastes the same. It came from a different plant, but it's still 100% sucrose. Sugar beet sugar is 100% sucrose and nothing else. It cannot contain DNA simply because of its molecular the molecular makeup of it. The way the molecule is composed, the components of the molecule. The components of the sugar molecule says it cannot contain a GMO. GMO is only included in the DNA and in the protein that's processed from the DNA. And if it doesn't have any nitrogen in it, if it doesn't have any phosphorus in it, then you know it had neither protein nor DNA in it, and it's okay to eat. And the same thing goes with corn oil. Corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil. It's oil. It's a lipid. It's an unsaturated lipid, which makes it better for you than a saturated. And there's very, very little difference between sunflower oil and corn oil. I looked this up, and as far as being saturated, how saturated is this? Okay, now this is kind of interesting. Sunflower oil is 90% unsaturated and 10% saturated. There's a little bit of saturated oil in it, but not much. So what do you think? Have I convinced you? Now remember, this is something that you did not study in school. You probably, most of you, now I'm not saying everybody, because some of you may have. Some of you out there watching this may have actually taken biochemistry and may have learned this. But I would say the great majority of people who are watching this have never had biochemistry, and there was no reason for them to know this. They never learned it in school. Nobody ever taught it to them. And that doesn't make them stupid. It just means they never learned it. There's a lot of things that I never learned. I couldn't tell you the first thing about mechanics, other than what I learned in physics. But as far as being a mechanic and overhauling a car or an engine, I barely know where to put in the oil and the gas. No, I don't know anything about that. But this is something that I do know about. So I hope I've been able to teach you something today, because that's, like I said, one of the reasons that I'm making YouTube videos is so I can help you learn things that you didn't know before. And if one person out there learned from this and believes what I'm saying, then I've done my job. So bye, y'all. See you next time.